Hey guys, so I thought I'd talk about something that is, well, it's not as big as a debate as the single quotes versus double quotes or like where you put your brackets, but it's a it's a topic that is really difficult to settle our community around, and it's frameworks. When do you use frameworks and when do you avoid them, and for what purposes do you use frameworks? Now, for the intent and for purposes of this discussion, it's going to, or rather my thoughts about it, it's going to be mostly around the classic web framework. So for PHP, let's say that's Laravel. For something like, I don't know, Express.js for Node, that sort of stuff, Rails for Ruby and so forth, like these big frameworks that kind of solve a common problem that we have. For the most part, this is a web-based server system in this scenario. And so usually you'll hear people talk about the pros and the cons with these, and to me there are a few pros and a few cons, and I was just going to share my thoughts on them, and then hopefully we'll arrive at some final thought about when to use them and when not to use them. So one of the big benefits of a framework, as I see it, especially if you do something like Express or React or like Angular for JavaScript stuff, like any type of like holistic solution to a problem that you have for building applications, is that you will, in an ideal case, problems that you yourself would have to solve have already been solved for you, and that's a great thing. It will, in theory, make you more productive and make you able to produce higher quality applications. And this is true for, like, that's usually what we do. Like, what is the saying? I stand on the shoulders of giants. Because if you think about it, a lot of abstractions and interfaces that are provided to you, even in the base languages, if you're doing something like Java, for example, do you have any idea how many years has gone into the Java platform? There are so many people who have spent so much time to create all these classes and interfaces and all that good stuff that you just take for granted, or that we all take for granted. And that's it. Like this, you're getting this in theory for free, and it's the same thing with these frameworks. The difference between that and these frameworks is that, like, at some point you will have this, like, because we kind of have to make a distinction between what a framework is and what a language is. Because I mean, if you want to be really hardcore about not using frameworks or any type of third-party code, because some of the arguments against frameworks are just that, you don't want to use somebody else's code that you can control. But if that's the case, you'll if you want to be really philosophical, you're going to have to go down and write your own binary code, or C code or whatever. Like, at some point you're gonna consume somebody else's API. It's just the way that it works. And although I can agree with this idea that it's nice to not have somebody else's third party like library, you always have to be pragmatic about these things, because, to put it simply, there are libraries that are, and frameworks that are so massively complicated that if you were to try and write them yourself, you would not be able to produce any type of application in a meaningful, like, in essence, you wouldn't be able to do it. So, like, but that's the big positive part about the framework, in my opinion, that somebody has taken the time to really do the stuff for you. The second part that I think is really nice about frameworks is that it gives us all a common blueprint. So one of the big problems that we had in JavaScript land a while back, in some cases it's still a big problem for a lot of companies, is that because there isn't, like, I usually say that the problem with jQuery is that jQuery is too much freedom. It's very powerful. jQuery is immensely powerful. It's not as relevant today as it was, but it was really powerful. But I argue that the majority of people who built JavaScript applications. That's why, you know, Angular and React and these frameworks are getting popular, because it's so poorly maintained. Like these jQuery applications, and it's not because of jQuery. It's not their fault at all. It's because the fact of the matter is that if you give people too much freedom without any type of direction or way to think about how to structure a problem, they simply can't solve it. It's the problem becomes too loose, too abstract. There's no blueprint, if you will. And I think that's what the problem with, that's why React and Angular and these frameworks are getting so popular, because they are trying to give you a blueprint for how to build a certain type of application, or how to, you know, create a scalable long-term project. And that's what Laravel and these other web frameworks are doing as well, and Express as well. Like, they're just trying to provide you with a set of APIs, so like common functionality that is going to help you build a web server. That's it. Well, that's the idea. They usually do a lot more than that, especially Laravel. Laravel does a lot more than that. Same thing goes for a lot of the web frameworks you find in .NET and so forth. They have much more power than that. Now, those are, to me, the two main benefits. The secondary and third, if we're going to end on the magic 3 of benefits, is that when you standardize on a framework, it becomes much easier for you to find people who will be able to be productive, and like your development speed ideally will go up, not just because people have saved you the time of writing code, but because there are best practices and patterns to writing a certain application. I mean, if I've been working on a application in vanilla JavaScript for 5 years, and I built my own that's what happened for me at Ticketmaster. They created their own solution system, which was in fact so horribly designed that it got to the point where it was unmaintainable. That risk is always going to be bigger if you, and I'm not going to say always, but in general that risk is very high when you have people who roll their custom solution without being really, really, really good at what they do. And like, few people are that good, because few people have that type of experience. That's the promise of a framework, that the framework is created by people ideally who have done this so many times that they know how to build a generic solution to this problem. On the con side, so the consequences of using a framework, and the biggest problem I argue with it, is that you lock yourself into somebody else's technology, which means that in general you're opting into a solution to a problem that you may not have. And to expand on that a little bit, think of it this way. So let's say that I'm in Java land, and now this is usually not a problem, because like Oracle and I would say that it's probably C# and Java who have the most stable packages in the world. Like, nobody else even gets close. But what I'm trying to say here is that if you opt into like one of these off-the-shelf solutions, or React or whatever, what usually happens is that you're looking for maybe a few things in that framework, but you're getting much more on top of it. And the more code and the more stuff you have that belongs to somebody else, the more dependent you are on these people. And in some cases it's perfectly fine, but you always have that risk. To put it in a more concrete example, let's say that you use Bootstrap. Now, Bootstrap, I argue, is probably the most misused, tightly followed by jQuery, library there is. Like, I argue that the vast majority of websites that use Bootstrap only use Bootstrap for the layout, so that they can create columns and like that responsive layout that Bootstrap did so very, very well. But the Bootstrap is much bigger than that. Like, Bootstrap contains so much more than just that part, but you still, most people don't even optimize that. You can actually just extract those layout structures if you wanted to, but very few do it. So let's talk about performance in that scenario. I mean, you're loading so much more on your page, even though you're just using a tiny portion of it. The same thing goes for jQuery. I've seen it 100 times. People use jQuery for like maybe just the Ajax call or one more function, which is once again what this is kind of what I'm saying. You're opting into a framework, you're getting that framework, and you're using but your use case is very small in comparison. So you should always be very aware of that when you look at the framework. Be really sure that that framework is well supported, and that you're actually looking at it from a perspective where, okay, this is solving all of the problems that I have. So it's so you're not like maybe you're looking for a really big framework when you should be reaching for a very small library. For me, like if you want to do Ajax in a nicer way in the browser today, you can use the native fetch API, because the Ajax API has been very much improved. And if you're doing like say Bootstrap stuff and you need layout and stuff like that, that's really old stuff now. You don't have to do that anymore. You have Flexbox, and Grid is coming up as well with a lot of support. So that's the first con of like having this framework, because you're getting dependent on somebody else. The second con of a framework is that you will over time depend, and this very much depends on the life cycle of your application. Now, most of us don't think in terms of how applications that will outlive our involvement in the project. I mean, how many of you guys have ever thought, hey, maybe the decision I'm making now will be a problem for me in 10 years? I don't plan a week ahead in my life, but like for a large system or for a big company or whatever, or a product that is there are products that will actually live that long. You have to really ask yourself, because that's what I feel about React and Angular and all these JavaScript frameworks. I can tell you right now, I am fairly sure that in a few years these frameworks will not be the de facto standard. We will have, as a community, moved on to maybe the next thing. And the next thing, I mean, it doesn't feel like that right now, but if you look back, you see that it happens all the time. I don't think that we will in any time soon get to a level of stability that is going to rival like Java and C#. Like, those are exceptions to the rule, I would argue. But that's something that's very real. So and a thing I'm trying to sell people is that, if you're going to use React for something, make sure that that it's really valuable to you. Make sure that you really have this dynamic re-rendering need, which, like, with a lot of animations or like drag and dropping or anything that makes you need to restructure the DOM or have a very liquid layout where you need to be able to move things and maybe drag and drop them around and stuff like that. Because if you don't have that need, if my favorite example is, if you're making a web shop, then don't use any framework. Use vanilla JavaScript and Webpack. That's it. You don't have to do anything else, because that's going to be easier for you to maintain over time. And since you don't have a need for the power that React gives you, then why use it? It doesn't make any sense. So that's the second con. You lose the ability, you lose flexibility over time, because look at us today. I mean, there are tons of people who are now locked into like really old versions of Angular, or really old. I mean, that's relative, and they're already trying to migrate. I mean, Telia here in Sweden, they're trying to migrate. Can you imagine how big that project is? Whoever got them invested in Angular should be fired. Well, I'm not going to be that extreme, but the architect who made that decision for that company is now the entire company is right now paying for that mistake, because it is a mistake. If you as a really large company is standardizing on a technology for all your platforms, and with not even 2 years distance between the adoption of this framework and this new release, you're forced to rewrite most of what you're doing or like migrate everything. I'm not saying that it's a bad thing or like that you shouldn't be doing that. I'm just saying that I generally really big companies don't want to have to rewrite or migrate their code base in such a short amount of time. That's why I argue C# and Java are so popular in the corporate world, because they don't change that much. Like, you just keep on adding features and you don't have to update things as often. That's a big value for these companies where the cost of doing that migration is massive. I mean, Volvo, they're migrating a large portion of their system from COBOL over to Java. That's a 10-year investment for them. It's as you can see, that's a 10-year investment and that's not just one person working on that. 10 years. That's, as you can imagine, massive. So that's the second con, losing long-term flexibility. And apart from these two things, I'm struggling to find anything else that's bad with frameworks. Maybe let's call it weight, if you will. That usually you have a lot of extra dependencies and a lot of extra stuff that you don't need, but we kind of covered that already. But yeah, these are like the base thoughts I have about pros and cons with frameworks. Now, what I will tell you as a general rule of thumb is, and this is the only advice I can really give on this, ask yourself really, really, really often, do I really need this? My approach has always been, I need to ask myself, is this critical? Is this going to give me something that is going to speed up my development or somehow overshadow the risk of adding it as a dependency? Because like, if you come and talk to me about like some modern framework or a tool you're using or something like that, I'm immediately going to ask you, what's the value to me? Like, how much more productive or how much better is my code going to get from using this tool? And if you start going like, oh, it's kind of nice to have, then I'm not interested. In my world, I'm very minimalistic. Either it's critical for me to have it, or it's not critical. Because, or rather, like, I can be okay with a non-critical dependency if I can remove it whenever I want. But if I lock myself into something in any way, which means for me that it's difficult for me to change in the future, I can't just remove it whenever I want, then it has to be a critical dependency. To me, that is stuff like a test runner and tools and stuff like that makes me productive, or a very, very like the framework I'm choosing. And you have to really ask yourself, is the value that I'm getting from this framework going to be, a make or break type of thing for my project? Because I argue that, if you're ever in a situation where you don't really know what you need to build your thing, then don't just jump into a framework. Just really ask yourself, like, is this worth it? And just keep on asking yourself that whenever you're going to make a decision, if you're going to use a framework or not. Always, don't just jump into something because it's popular. Ask yourself, what is this going to give me that is going to make me so much more productive? Because if you're really honest with yourself, and I'm looking at you, like the React and Angular people of this world, if you're really honest with yourself, does every single application you're making have to be in React or Angular? I don't think so.